Hello, and thank you very much for joining us in this module. This module is very important because we will go through a sample report for the IET. We would look at the comments that we have put in place. So this is going to help you as you prepare your report. We've provided this example for you so you can download it and go through. Hopefully this will inspire you as you prepare your own reports. So I'm going to start with the comment in yellow. So that's what you see highlighted. And what we've said is, this is a very good example. So this report is a very good example. In particular, this section of the report, okay? This section here. So this is a very good example that shows how the candidate tells the story of what they did and how they demonstrated the different UK-SPEC competencies in bracket. The candidate starts with a project heading, provides a project summary, clearly spells out the challenge, and proceeds to tell us how they overcame the challenge. Throughout this example, okay, this project example, the candidate clearly tells us the technology that he used, whether he was already proficient in it or had to research or study to gain the necessary level of knowledge to execute the task. They also told us what exact engineering judgments they made and the thought process behind making the judgments. The candidate shows several examples of risk assessments and good adherence to relevant industry standards. So let's dig into the project. So the first project is this one, obviously, in the candidate's role as a lead structural engineer. Now, main project executed, packaging facility modification project. And the candidate says, I worked on the concept design, detailed design, and construction phases for a £5 million project to install a personal protective equipment PPE packaging facility within an existing building. The facility complied with current good manufacturing practice and is in Glasgow. The project operated on a cost reimbursable contract, and as lead civil and structural engineer, I collaborated with a multiple discipline team of design consultants on this project. Civil and structural elements involved the fit out of a high bay warehouse to house a 2-story mezzanine and the design of super and substructures for ancillary equipment. Now, what's the comment here? So we said a good project outline and summary showing the cost of the project, the type of contract, the life cycle phases you were involved in, and a summary of your achievements. Okay, now this paragraph would give the assessors a very good preview of what is to come. So this is how you should structure it. This paragraph tells us the whole story and it gives us a taste for what is to come. So that's the project outline. And then if you look at the next paragraph, it gives a context or the challenge. So what exactly was the challenge? And the candidate talks about what the challenge was. Okay. So the client identified the high bay warehouse on the site, which was not being used to its full capacity. A new 2-story mezzanine occupying half of the warehouse would provide sufficient floor area for the PPE packaging line. However, a fundamental client expectation for this was to preserve key features which would enable the removal of the facility and reinstate the high bay warehouse if required to do so in the future. So we know exactly what the context and the challenge was. Okay. So that's the comment we provided. So as you prepare your report, make sure you have that paragraph that tells us exactly what the challenge was. And then there's a comment and a highlight here in yellow. it talks about a concern the candidate has. I was concerned that the project will incorrectly categorize the mezzanine structures execution class. So this was early on in the project. Okay, so the comments we put there was that it is important to get the classification correct right from the start, because based on the classification, the project would take the necessary steps. Okay, and obviously the classification can affect how much is spent on the project. And then it continues. So this comment here is on the fact that the candidate was performing risk assessment right from the start. Okay, so that's something you should consider as you prepare your report. The assessors will look for evidence of you considering options. So you consider the risks, you consider sustainability and things like that. So for this paragraph, what's the comment here? So we're saying that it is good to consider risk, safety, life cycle, processes, and design at the initial stage of the process. So this is under the A competence of the UK-SPEC. For this comment, we are saying that site surveys at the initial phase is necessary. So obviously the candidate had to perform surveys to know what the site was like and what was to be considered. So here the candidate is providing an example of an engineering judgment which was based on the candidate's knowledge and experience. Okay, so the paragraph or the sentence says, I identified the best way to maintain functionality would be to use the existing piled floor structure and avoid the need of new foundation. So this is something, a judgment the candidate is making based on experience or knowledge. So this is what we said. As you write your paragraphs, make sure you mention the UK-SPEC competence that was considered. In this case, it was competence A and B. So here the comment was, this was a good example of competence A because the candidate has applied a technology. So this is a technology that the candidate is applying. Obviously, in the interview, you would have to expect questions on the technology you've applied. So questions like, why did you select that technology? Why not others? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this technology? On this paragraph, the comment is that this is an excellent example of how to present information logically. The candidate showed use of relevant standards, carried out research, assessment, and arrived at a decision. So this is exactly what we want to see. So I'll just read this paragraph so you have context for what we're saying. So the candidate said, however, the number of piles for a reasonable sample size and the lack of cartilage due to congestion on site meant that this was not practical. I then reverse engineered the building to assess what the capacity of the piles would have been. I had evidence that the original warehouse was a general store and what the storage height was. I used that British standard 6399, the code of practice for dead and imposed loads, to research the imposed load per meter height of storage the building would have been designed for. I concluded that the piles had reasonable capacity. I used this evidence to suggest using a transfer structure to bypass the floor slab, which would minimize damage and get loads to the piles. So this is competence A and B, as you see in the paragraph, in the parentheses. Okay, so like we said, excellent example of how to present information logically. The candidate showed use of relevant standards, carried out research, assessment, and arrived at a decision. So here, what we are saying is this is an excellent example of competence A and also competence E. The candidate is saying that from experience, I know that solid CO2 sublimes to cause asphyxiation indoors. So this is under safety, health and safety, and also competence A, showing that the candidate is demonstrating their knowledge or using knowledge and experience. Here we are saying the highlight is this is an example of a good A competence. So the candidate is saying, I decided to utilize glass reinforced plastic panels on cold formed steel joints for the floor system. So the candidate is decided to use it based on the fact that they knew that this was a reliable material. So that is the first role. All this is the first role. And then we go to the next role, which is the candidate was a lead civil and structural engineer. And the comment we have in yellow is, this is another very good example of where the candidate presents their information logically and provides evidence to show compliance with the UK-SPEC. So just like the first one, this first paragraph is about the context and the challenge. And the second paragraph is on the project outline. Okay, so the thing to note is that if the assessor is going through your project, by reading these two paragraphs alone, they get a full picture for what the challenge was, the context, the cost, the budget, basically a summary of what is to come. Okay. And you can see that throughout the report, the candidate puts the competence mentioned in parentheses. Here, what comments did we have? We said that applying knowledge to solve engineering problems. So that's what the candidate did in this paragraph. So that's A and B. In one sentence, they have stated the problem and how they solved it. So let's just read this paragraph and see what the candidate did here. The personnel flows which were devised concluded there was insufficient space for occupants and a side extension to the warehouse and break room was required. I reviewed the record information of the foundations which supported the building's perimeter columns and identified that it was congested and hence a lean-to construction extension would be required. I sized a simple lean-to frame which had a composite floor slab for a mezzanine break room. I reviewed the foundations for the lean-to with the existing services and drainage information and identified that the foundations would clash. I decided to produce a drainage modification plan as it would be important to improve the accuracy of the cost of the project for the next stage. This is competence A and B. The candidate provided evidence of competence E as well, as you can see. This is another good example of competence E, where the candidate performed risk assessments. So this is a very good example. The candidate produced a designer risk assessment and performed reviews with the safety, health and environment and quality advisor. This paragraph shows examples of competence A and B. This paragraph shows an example of competence C and E. So obviously competence C because the candidate is talking about budget, and competence E because the candidate is talking about working on the structure, okay, the weight, and talking about review structural items. So that's an example of competence C and E. And then this is another example. So what do we have as as a comment here? So in yellow, we said this example, although good, is structured as a list of what the candidate delivered rather than a logical presentation of what the candidate did and how they did it. So that's what we're saying here. So the candidate needs to add more meat to the bones. So we are saying that for this experience, so that's on the candidate's position as a senior control and instrumentation engineer. So whilst this is good, it is a bit light on information. The information here is presented more like a list. So you can see how small this paragraph is. You can see how small this other paragraph is. So the candidate should structure this example like the previous ones, where you can see more lengthy paragraphs that provides more insight as to what exactly the candidate did. So whilst this is good on the surface, it needs more depth. That's the comment we're putting here. Okay. So that's why the comment says, in summary, I would not score the candidate very high in competence A and B because the candidate didn't go into depth as to how they arrived at the engineering judgments. So that's why the candidate wouldn't score very high under competence A and B for this particular example. Okay. So we'll just look at one or two comments anyway. So for here, under this paragraph, we are saying it's very good to produce quality plans as part of a good project management. For this one, site visit early on in the project to get a good feel for what to expect on the project. That's good. And then this comment here was, this is a very good C competence. So why? Because the candidate analyzed contract variations from the contractors and negotiated additional funding for the project. In addition, the candidate carried out a review of the monthly status report of the vendor to monitor project performance and ensure that work was within project program and budget. Very, very good C competence example. And the comment here is, this is a good A competence because the candidate performed some research. So that's very good. The research was aimed at extending knowledge to enable the candidates to perform work on that project, on the technical aspect of the project. And the comment here is, this is a very good example of ethics. So the candidate applied the ethical principle of confidentiality by respecting all non-disclosure agreements between the companies. So this is a project in a nutshell. I've provided this as an example. Take your time to go through, read through the examples. If you've got questions, contact us. We can actually help you with your report. So I'll just summarize by going through the comments in yellow. And what we're saying is that in this report, the candidate has used 3 projects. So the candidate has used 3 examples. And considering the word count, this is more than enough. And remember that it is not about quantity, but quality. If a candidate has 15 years of experience within the same company, for instance, they are not expected to write about everything that they have done. All they need to do is to select their top 3 projects during their 15 years within that company. It might even be one project during the 15 years. So for instance, you could have a candidate working on the design and construction of a new nuclear power station, which can take as long as 20 years or even more to design. So the candidates will have changed roles whilst working on that same project. Okay, so you are not expected to have each project example this lengthy. So that's what we're saying. You are not expected to assign a competence to a paragraph. That's not, feasible. You would observe that the competencies are interwoven. So what we are saying is that you could have one paragraph that has competence A, B, and even E We've seen so many examples of that. Okay, so do not think you need to put one competence in each paragraph. This is a very good example. This paragraph has got examples of competence C and E. This one has got examples of competence C and B. You see, some have even got up to 3 competencies in one paragraph. Okay, so that's what we're saying there. And we said that project 1 had 1,600 words. And this is only because of the quality of the experience that the candidate presented. So the candidate had good examples of risk assessment and showed good use of STAR. So this one project is equivalent to 2 or even 3 projects because of the variety of examples in that project. So project 1. Otherwise, 800 words per experience is more than enough. So what we're saying is this is one experience, this one. So this is one role. If you have 800 words, that is more than enough. So if you had 3 roles, 3 times 800 gives 2,400 words. That is more than sufficient. And so we said your project should follow the normal course of storytelling. So conception, detailed design, construction phase, commissioning phase, and so on. So whether you present 3, 4, or 5 projects, the maximum word count of between 2,000 and 2,500 words is reasonable. So it's important to structure your report accordingly. So that's what we have for how to prepare your reports. Contact us if you need support in this regard, and we'll help you produce your report. Thank you very much for listening, and we wish you the very best. See you very soon in the next module.